As much as online communities are at the forefront of technological advancements, with the internet itself a kind of ever-expanding frontier, charting and chronicling the terrain of the possible, there are also communities full of people who want to resist this sort of relentless forward propulsion. Like in a world that seems increasingly hi-fi, have you ever considered going
Lo-fi?
If you have, you're not alone. In recent years, YouTube channels and streaming playlists have embraced a kind of stripped-back sonic minimalism. Playlists for deep relaxation and lo-fi beats to study to have been doing Drake numbers. Well, maybe not Drake numbers, but still racking up millions of streams, nothing to sneeze at. These tracks run the gamut. There's more traditional ambient or lo-fi songs inspired by artists like Brian Eno, who made these sort of hypnotic sonic soundscapes that felt more like oral wallpaper than pop or rock music. It was sort of like the canned music you'd hear in an airport. In fact, Eno's first ambient album was actually titled Ambient 1, Music for Airports, but more thoughtful. I could imagine being slightly less stressed out if this was being piped over the speakers while I was languishing in a TSA security line. And then there's the lo-fi ambient stuff that feels more like a remix or a filter placed over existing music. Heck, you could even cue up a vibily verbed out 6-hour loop of Brian Eno's Music for Airports, which would be great for doing homework or napping in the rain, or I guess standing in a really long TSA security line. One of the most popular modern lo-fi ambient channels in this latter category is Lo-Fi Girl. It boasts nearly 14 million subscribers on YouTube and hosts live streams where people flood the chat with comments like, well, I don't really know what this stuff means. Much of it appears to be in Dutch. Anyway, the channel is named after the young woman in the videos, who is depicted in loops, sitting at a desk, studying in the dark, while her cute little kitty cat stares out the window. A little counterintuitively, for something meant to be so chill and relaxed and passive, Lo-Fi Girl specifically has cultivated an engaged and active fan following. Again, people flood the chat with emojis and comments like, "Nothing, you?" Frankly, it doesn't seem like they're doing a lot of relaxing or studying. Some superfans have even scanned the videos for clues to some deep fictional world unfolding in the Lo-Fi Girl universe. And even more weirdly, they have been right.
Hi guys, I just woke up. Everything is happening all at once. Let's go over the Lo-Fi Girl lore, because shit is happening with Lo-Fi Girl right now.
You know that Lo-Fi Girl on YouTube? It's the one where you want to lock in and study, so you search up Lo-Fi and there's a girl in like a green pullover and she's writing tests and there's a cat behind her, right? There's whole lore about this now. There's a theory going on how she went missing recently. Nobody in the community knows what happens to her or like where she went, right? But in the back of her window, there's like a building. There's like a blue light that flickers. Yeah. And supposedly that's Morse code for something. A lot of people in the community were putting random numbers in the chat and then deleting it, so nobody knows what it was. But recently, the scene on that YouTube video changed. So it wasn't her writing with a cat behind her no more. It was the blue room. It was the blue room with only a door, and that was it. So the community's like, what does it symbolize? And no one knows where she went or what she's doing right now. But the whole theory is like, is this the end because she got kidnapped? Is this the end of the sleeping stream?
Now, a lot of this stuff has drawn as much hatred inside the ambient community as it has attention in more general audiences. Some diehards have called out this stuff as being an affront to the purity and creativity of genuine ambient lo-fi music.
At its outset, like, ambient music was something that, like, you would have been kind of a nerd about music to be even encountering, you know? It was like music that record collectors or enthusiasts of ambient music specifically were into. And I think in the streaming era, a lot of this music is being presented to listeners under the auspices of like aids for relaxation, or, you know, you could just go on Spotify and pull up like a deep focus ambient playlist. And that has, in a cool way, from my perspective, opened up music that is like quite easy to understand and could be quite widely appealing to an audience of people who are maybe like outside of this sort of niche of listeners who were initially attracted to ambient music.
Right, because it feels like there's a tension here, and it seems like you feel like there's a tension here, right? Because this is a genre that people are putting a lot of thought and work into it, and then it's being widely consumed, but in a lot of ways just as like white noise in a sense.
But even beyond the question of what does or does not qualify as aesthetically relevant ambience, this whole trend seems kind of odd. After all, these playlists are ostensibly designed to sustain focus, or even to help listeners zone out and fall asleep. It's basically a notch or two above one of those white noise generators. Are there people online who are like, my dream egg is communicating with me secretly?
I don't know if you guys can hear that.
There probably are, but still the intensity of this community suggests that there is something deeper going on. In recent years, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, you hear a lot about loneliness. In 2023, the US Surgeon General's office released an 80-plus page report on the loneliness and isolation epidemic. In it, Surgeon General Dr. Vivek H. Murthy states that 1 in 2 American adults, that is, I believe, 50%, reported feeling some form of loneliness in their life. And that was before 2020. In short, a lot of people just don't have a lot of other people around them. You can cite all kinds of reasons for this. The decline in activities like church-going, or the total gutting of labor unions and other third places outside of home and work where people used to congregate and collect. Yes, these spaces had explicit purposes, like organizing workers to seize the means of production from cigar-chomping factory bosses who hoard all the wealth in a big burlap sack emblazoned with a dollar sign, or worshiping the god of one's choice. But they also had a secondary and maybe even more important function. They were places where people could just hang. Like, you know how on Friends and Seinfeld where they just all go shoot the shit at a coffee shop? Go to a coffee shop nowadays and you're more likely to find gig workers with headphones wired into their laptops and not people discussing the social acceptability of being draped head to toe in velvet.
You know, if it was socially acceptable...
I know you would drape yourself in velvet.
But forget about velvet. There's a more important fabric here, the social fabric. And it is, we are constantly being told, deteriorating. The US Surgeon General even says so. Given this feeling of loneliness, it's not that surprising that people would be comforted by music, or I guess more like generic audio or sounds that gives a sense of there being other people in your house, or apartment, or even in your headphones. There's a whole genre of lo-fi ambient tracks that are precisely about generating the sense that there's something going on elsewhere. This stuff can provide a deep sense of comfort, a feeling of other people just being around ambiently. But it can also be terrifying. I was struck by the terror of ambient spaces and of the sinister vibe of a TV blaring in the next room, watching Khaled Rabal's recent horror hit, Skinamarink. Ball cut his teeth on YouTube making patient short films bringing nightmares to life. His films are shot through with dread and very deliberately creeping terror. They are, in a big way, about the deep existential fear of being alone.
My name is Caleb Rabal. I'm the writer, director, editor of a lo-fi horror movie released in 2023 called Skinamarink. And before that, I ran a YouTube channel called Bite Size Nightmares that also had a lo-fi feel.
Skinamarink built on his work on YouTube. It is very basically a feature-length ambient nightmare, full of fuzzy, hard-to-make-out images and TVs playing old public domain cartoons. It's like a hellish extrapolation of every kid's unsettled feeling being left home alone. But in this way, it also feels engaged with the ongoing epidemic of loneliness and isolation, and it understands that those feelings, being alone, having nobody around, can be totally, bone-chillingly frightening. His films represent the contemporary plague of existential isolation as they should be understood. Really, really scary.
I think during film school, I had never really found my voice, and I think doing my Nightmare series helped me find out who I was as a filmmaker, and a big part of that was an attraction to lo-fi aesthetics, lo-fi sound, which I find very important. Like, a lot of times filmmakers will do throwback movies that mimic the look of old movies, but they rarely do it for sound, which I've always found strange because I feel like that's what really sells it, is like older sound. And before, or at least congruent with that series, I was getting into a lot of lo-fi music or what's called hauntology, so the musician, the caretaker. I think a lot of people know from the needle drop. That was kind of a formative thing for me. And there was other lo-fi things too. Like, I very much got into outsider music, which some of it doesn't always have a lo-fi sound, but a lot of it does, like Daniel Johnson, obviously. Big business monkey! But the ones that don't even necessarily have a lo-fi sound have this kind of, as folk can be, lo-fi philosophy, so to speak.
This understanding of ambient sounds, or even the concept of ambience, also calls back to very early ideas and tropes in horror fiction. Spooky stories are laced with such incidental sounds. The wind howling through some scraggly dead trees, the creak of the old floorboards, even those unplaceable, unnerving sounds of a house settling. Amid emptiness, even the most benign ambient sounds can be amplified in the mind to horrific effect. Just think of how a filmmaker like David Lynch uses industrial droning to set a sinister mood, or the crackle of TV static to create a feeling of foreboding or otherworldly intrusion. Even the whir of an overhead fan, a sound that is at least generally considered non-obtrusive, if not relaxing, becomes, in the mind of a madman, completely creepy. It's not just about grandma in the next room watching TV. These subtle noises, and even the idea of subtle noise, seems to point to some other dimension out there, somewhere. And that invisible, unseen realm could, for all we know, be teeming with ghosts and demons or malevolent spirits. But hey, at least you're not alone. In this context, were you then surprised or not surprised by how massive of a hit Skinamarink ended up being?
In this context, no, because number one, shades of this have been done before, but not as heavily. So Ty West's movie House of the Devil had a very strong 70s aesthetic, but not 70s sound. Like, a lot of these movies trying to mimic the style of an older movie kind of do it as pastiche or maybe for humorous effect. I was surprised that the movie was a success, don't get me wrong, but the fact that people were attracted to the lo-fi aesthetic and feel of it didn't particularly surprise me. That wasn't what surprised me. Just because well before I made the movie, it was already kind of popping off, particularly in the horror and internet horror sphere. I think, if anything, I was just surprised that someone hadn't necessarily done exactly what I did years before me.
The problem of loneliness and isolation just feels so deep and so real. The basic premise of the show is usually that the internet finds ways to bring people together, to connect over shared interests and creative pursuits. But despite the buzzing activity in the Lo-Fi Girl chat room, this subculture seems to be more geared towards acclimatizing you to sitting at home listening to the hum of a digital air conditioner in a virtual next room. This is appealing, sure, but that appeal is tied to grander, more despairing trends about where exactly the world is headed. Meaningful work and after-work activities narrowing, social lives getting increasingly sparse, the very real threat of viruses and pandemics that demand that we stay away from one another. Like, instead of the coffee shop from Seinfeld, we now have ambient videos imagining what it'd be like to hang out in Jerry Seinfeld from Seinfeld's empty apartment alone. It's fucking depressing. You can even see this stuff playing out in porn, where every website is log-jammed with videos around stepmom fucking or step-sibling sort of incest. I mean, back in the day, a pizza man had to come to your door, or you had to go to a job interview conspicuously hosted in a Spartan hotel suite. The idea of sexual fantasy involved other people. Now it's like it's impossible to even conceive of an erotic, sexualized relationship outside of your immediate family dynamic. And you're fantasizing this to masturbate, arguably the loneliest sex act of all. I guess if there's some sort of bright side to all this, it is that clever, creative people are still able to find a way to communicate this anxiety. It could be Brian Eno imagining a better sonic backdrop for the anxious or just boring experience of being in an airport or another liminal space. Or it could be Kyle Edward Ball ratcheting up isolation and the creepy sound of a TV droning in the next room to nightmarish levels. It could be my stepmom, who is stuck in a dryer trying to get that last sock, What's she gonna do? People will always find a way to address and think through and maybe even combat this sort of deep, abiding loneliness. And in a way, that makes me feel less alone. Now, if you'll excuse me, I do have to help my stepmom get out of that dryer. She is stuck quite bad.